A lot of climbers have no idea that their foot swapping technique is really holding them back. Some climbers know half the elements of a proper foot swap, but not the other half. For instance, do you even do the bounce when you do a foot swap? And if you do you only do it in one direction? And if so, when would you choose one direction versus another? Do you absorb on the backswing? Do you do a drop or a roll? And if so, why do you pick one over the other? If you don't immediately know what I'm talking about, then we should go through 5 basic principles that allow you to swap feet very efficiently and also consistently. The bottom line is, to climb harder, you're going to need to be able to swap feet on really small holds, and crucially, you're going to be able to need to do it when you don't have the luxury of taking your weight off the foothold. Swapping feet can be a kind of tipping point that causes you to fail on a climb. There is a technique to it which I'm about to describe, and if you get it wrong, then maybe you cut loose and that makes you fall off, or maybe a foot slips and that makes you fall, or maybe you just burn through so much power by hesitating and trying to find alternatives that you consequently fall off higher up the climb. Now, I'm sure that some of you would be watching this thinking, yeah, I actively avoid swapping feet, and that's really common among climbers, so don't think that you're alone in that, quite the opposite. Climbers often hesitate endlessly and search for alternatives to swapping when there really aren't any good ones. If that's you, then here's my direct advice. Stop avoiding it and attack it instead. It will make a big difference to your climbing. There are only a handful of things to know about swapping feet, and once you know them by the end of this video, and you've had a bit of exposure to practice, then it's not that difficult to do well. You will be able to do it. Likely you've just been making a few simple errors that make it seem way harder than it is. So first of all, a general point that applies to all footwork, not just swapping feet. I'm bringing this up first because if you don't pay attention to it, even if you swap feet correctly, it will still result in a complete mess. The first thing about foot swapping is to identify the target, the exact spot on the hold where you want the incoming foot to go. More often than not, it will be the same spot as where the outgoing foot already is. How do you know what the correct spot is? By observation and feel. Some footholds will have a bigger but slopey part and a small but in-cut part, and you'll have to use experience to judge which of these is the most useful for any given move. The key thing is to actively observe that detail and take notice of it and have attention to detail of the shape of the foothold before you use it. And once you've got one foot on it, update that observation with how the hold actually feels under your foot. All of that will help you to get onto the right target. It's obvious even to most beginners that you have to actively feel and notice the detail of how a handhold works, and you should do exactly the same with the footholds. But because our feet are bound up in tight rock shoes, we tend to lose this tendency to do this automatically. Instead, actively developing it as a habit will pay off. So the positioning of the feet on the foothold for the actual swap itself is critical, and I think it all really hinges on that. I would say that there are 2 main ways to do foot swaps. One of them I can't really do very well because of injury limitation, and because of that it's easier for me to show you like this, and so I'm going to show you the way that I don't use first. What both methods have in common is lining up the toe of the incoming foot so that it falls onto the correct spot on the foothold. What they also share is the use of dynamic movement in the rest of the body, and we'll come to that in just a moment. So I don't think there's an accepted name for either of these methods, so I'm just going to call this first method the drop and swap method. Drop because it involves dropping the heel of the outgoing foot in order to make space for the incoming foot to get as close as possible to that correct spot. As I drop that heel, I can actually see, looking in the top, the correct spot of the foothold. Now obviously to use this method you need to be able to drop your heel, i.e. dorsiflex your ankle, and that's the bit that I can't do. Because I've broken both my ankles many times, I immediately lost all the dorsiflexion in one ankle and almost all of it in the other ankle, so I don't tend to use this method. For those of you who have a perfectly good set of ankles, I would encourage you to stretch your ankles to keep this dorsiflexion, because people do tend to lose it as they get older. And of all the joints that it's useful to have flexible in climbing, I think the ankle is right up there. People often talk about hip flexibility, but I think ankle flexibility is just as important. You'll note here that there's a little bit of pressure, a little bit of friction on the front of the toe just here, and that sometimes allows you to place the foot and drop it with just a little bit of control. This front part of the toe rand is not a part of the foot that people are often used to using, but you have to learn to use it quite a lot with both methods of swapping feet. So the purpose of dropping the heel is to avoid the kind of rock shoe sandwich situation where you're really standing with the incoming foot on top of the outgoing foot, such that when that outgoing foot comes away, it's going to pull the incoming foot with it, and that's often what makes people have the foot slip. So when you drop the heel, there's far less contact of rubber between both feet. It's a little bit elevated from the foothold, and as it drops, as the heel drops, it sinks down into the correct position. If I keep the toe too pointed down the way as it slides, can you see that the edge of the toe there is not pointing right into the back of the foothold? So it actually needs to be a little bit higher so that it kind of wraps into place. So the precision really matters here. You also want to anticipate where you want the incoming foot to be, like what angle you want it to be at. So let's say that for the next move, I want my hips to be more turned out, more open. So I want the inside of my foot to be closer to the wall like this. So in that case, I may need to cross my heels over in preparation to do the drop and swap like that. But if I want the incoming foot to be more straight on or even a little bit outside edged, then I might not need to cross my heels. I might just need to place my heels quite close together but not crossed, so that they drop onto the correct position like that. So as I say, I don't tend to use this method because I can't really drop my heels very much. And so if I do use this method, then my foot tends to catch, and as the lower foot comes out, it tends to pull that one with it. So I favour the other method. Now again, I don't think there's any particular name for this method either, but I'm going to call it the roll and swap. And for this one, you have to roll your ankle out the way. Interestingly, when I show this to climbers, they don't always tend to get the roll aspect of the movement straight away, and instead they tend to move into internal rotation instead. And unfortunately, internal rotation doesn't solve the problem that we're trying to solve, which is having a rock shoe sandwich where one foot's making a lot of contact with the foot underneath. And so when this one pulls away, it's going to pull that one with it. I'm going to roll it like that. So you can almost see the sole of your own foot, get it as close to the sweet spot on the hold as possible. You whip the outgoing foot out of the way, and then that foot can just roll onto position right in the right spot. Now again, it's probably a good idea to drop the heel of the outgoing foot as much as you possibly can, and also to touch the front edge of the toe rand against the wall to get a little bit of friction just there, so that you've got a little bit of support and a little bit of control to control the roll of the incoming foot onto the foothold. And if you do that in combination with the bounce, then it all works together really well. And I find this method, once you get used to it, to be really efficient, and it just feels really nice and satisfying and accurate to do. And I find that I can reliably do it, even in situations where I can't afford for that foot to slip because I'm unprotected. The key to this is very much what you do with the rest of the leg. So I'm obviously sitting down here, but when I'm actually doing a move, you tend to need to drop down a little bit, bending your knees, so that the foot that's about to swap, you actually can turn that knee on its side to open out the one hip, and that facilitates the rolling of the ankle. If I try to do it with my knees still close together, my ankles are not very flexible, but I can't really turn that ankle on its side. I have to do that. And that also allows me to see between my legs and look very carefully that that foot's going to be on the right spot, and then execute the swap. So swapping feet when the handholds are good enough that we can just take all the weight on our arms is not all that difficult. You don't really need a YouTube video to tell you how to do that. The challenge that we have is when we don't have the luxury of taking our weight off our feet, and the classic example of that is holding two flat undercuts. To do this properly, we need to borrow a second from gravity, and to do that, we need to bounce. Let's say I'm swapping from the left foot to the right foot. To prepare for the actual swap itself, I'll start off by sinking down just a little bit. It doesn't need to be far. And then I sort of bounce up in quite an explosive fashion. And then at the crest of the bounce, I execute the swap. And as I come back down, I sort of absorb the back swing. So there's nothing very complicated about the bounce, you just need to remember to do it. However, it does get a lot more interesting if we move over there onto the steep board. So when we come to the steep board, things get a bit more complicated. We don't just have to resist gravity with our bounce in order to do the swap. We also have to resist the backswing, the tendency to cut loose and for the lower body to swing away from the wall. So if I just pick an example here on two fairly decent holds, but both over my head, so there's quite a lot of potential for my lower body to swing away. And then this one black foothold down here. So you can see that if I let go of that foothold, I'll swing away from it. But it is quite a decent foothold, it's quite positive. I can hold this position relatively relaxed, but swapping feet is still statically, if I try and do it without doing all the techniques I've shown you, it's still gonna not really work at all. So I need to bounce up the way, just as I've shown you on the other wall, but I also need to do an inward bounce. And to do that, I actually use my hips. So as well as bouncing up off my leg, I'm also throwing my hips in and bouncing them in the way. And then again at the crest of the bounce, that's when I execute the swap. And then as I bite with the incoming foot, then I allow my bum to come back away from the wall and absorb the backswing during that process. So if I just swap back and forth a few times. Did you notice there what I was doing with the leg of the outgoing foot? So that outgoing foot is not just staying near the wall, it's actually coming away. And what that does is it's another way to help absorb the backswing and just buy you a bit more time to build up pressure with the incoming foot and really bite it so that it doesn't just slip off. So if I now switch to swapping on this white foothold, which is a lot more sloping, then that's going to be a lot more difficult. So I really need to maintain, whereas that one I can hang quite passively. This one I really need to maintain quite an active tension. That's a really quite difficult swap. You can see that my foot did drift down the foothold a little bit, and I think swapping back to the other foot will be really hard. Yeah, I can't quite do it. Oh yeah. Now, that foothold, being as bad as it is actually one of these cases where it's an unusual case and it may need a different strategy altogether. That's the one rule of climbing technique, is that there's such infinite variety in movement that there are always exceptions to every generality. Where the foothold is so bad, where I can't absorb that backswing fast enough to regain tension on that foot. So it may be better to actually allow myself to cut loose, especially because my handholds are quite good, and then do a more controlled swing out with both feet and then swing the other foot on. So let's try it. So if I start with that foot and come off, that was much easier. Didn't quite time it right. You need to get the timing perfect. So there's a few parts to that. One was that I kept my arms quite bent because I need to exert a fair bit of control around my shoulders in order to get the movement just right. The other thing was that in order to get the correct amount of bounce, I needed to push away, so I actually needed to push off the foothold to allow myself to swing out enough, but not too much, and then swing back. Now, getting the exact amount of swing is crucial, otherwise it won't work. Hopefully you can see that on the split second where my incoming foot makes contact with the foothold, I immediately build up tension. So again, this is only a technique that I would use where the foothold was so bad, where I just couldn't do the foot swap in the normal way, and only experience will tell you to anticipate that that's going to be the case. So that is another top of the line aspect of movement technique in climbing. A couple of weeks ago I made another video on climbing footwork about the counterbalancing foot, and after watching that video, many of you liked the video or actually subscribed to my channel, and if that was one of you, then thank you. I know it seems like kind of a small thing, just pressing a like button or subscribing, but it really does help me to make these videos and also to know which of them is most useful to you, because this channel is for you after all. So coming up shortly, I have an episode about the technique of climbing on steep boards. Previously, I've made videos about structuring your sessions on steep boards, and if you'd like to see that episode, I'll link to it just there. But technically, there is a bit of a knack to climbing on steep ground, such as 45 degrees. So if you'd like to see that one, then please do subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode.